recently took a training on I-CBT, Inference-Based Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. When I started the training, I became really uncomfortable when I started to hear some differences between this model and ERP, Exposure and Response Prevention. The agreement between the two is that both really emphasize the importance on avoiding or preventing compulsions from happening in order to cope with your OCD. But there were two big differences. ERP really obviously encourages exposures. They do exposures and making people intentionally uncomfortable to help people learn how to sit with uncertainty in their OCD symptoms. Well, ICBT actually teaches and encourages people to gain certainty with their OCD symptoms. And the other big difference is ERP views obsessions or doubts or intrusive thoughts, whatever language you want to use, as pretty meaningless, where ICBT really focuses on the idea of being able to track and understand those obsessions to see if it really is a way of understanding the context or the world around you or how you view yourself. ICBT theorizes that OCD happens when there is inferential confusion in the picture, or when people have a failure to discriminate between imagined possibilities that are happening around them right now and the actual reality that's happening around them right now. And this can happen in a couple of different ways, such as when people are distrusting of their senses. So I'm walking away from my car and my doubt, my fear, my obsession is, wait, did I lock my car? Maybe I didn't lock my car. Maybe I only think that I locked my car. Another way inferential confusion comes in is when we're over-reliant on the possibilities. Oh man, I almost got in a car accident a couple weeks ago, so now I have to be very hyper-vigilant and kind of have my head on a swivel if I'm going to avoid hurting people and getting car accidents in the future. And another way that inferential confusion can happen is by relevant associations. So our thought is, for example, oh my gosh, I heard a story that most serial killers have left hands. And I'm left-hand dominant, so maybe I'm more likely to be a serial killer. The ICBT model has 12 different models to it, or steps you go through, and each step is walking the clients through being able to understand their OCD symptoms, patterns, ways of faulty reasoning with them, and moving to them actually trusting their sensations so that they have a firm grip on the here and now rather than relying on compulsions to give them the reassurance from that anxiety they feel. There are a few things that I really appreciated about the ICBT model. The first one is that it doesn't really focus on exposures. While it can incorporate them, it's not really an essential like it is for exposure and response prevention. So exposure and response prevention therapy, right? Fantastic model of therapy. I practice it with my clients, but there's a high level of buy-in that needs to happen because anxiety exposures in their definition are supposed to be uncomfortable, and it's really hard for people to kind of willingly walk into therapy and say, okay, I'm ready to be uncomfortable. With treating OCD with ICBT, we don't have to do that. You can make a lot of really good progress with your OCD symptoms without doing the exposure exercises. And so I really like that it kind of lowers the bar for people to enter the therapy process and treat their OCD symptoms. Second thing I really like about ICBT is that it really emphasizes this gaining of understanding or recognizing of patterns of OCD. So with ERP, there can a lot of times be this really defeating process where people have a specific obsession, right? Like fear of touching doorknobs or things like that, or faucets, or fear of, something like that. And so they work really hard and do a bunch of exposure exercises, allow themselves to feel uncomfortable to make some success, only to then have their OCD switch and move on to another obsession, and for them to kind of fall all the way back down and say, man, I got to start all this exposure work over again so that I can work on my new fear or my new obsession, where ICBT really focuses on recognizing the patterns and having people recognize, this is how OCD works. It always gives me an obsession and a doubt. It always tells me that there's a big scary consequence and tells me that maybe there's something really wrong with me if I were to allow that consequence to happen, and then it forces me to do this compulsion so that I minimize that risk of it happening, and here it is again. And so it helps us be able to kind of take those obsessions and those fears and doubts less seriously by just simply recognizing the pattern. I kind of compare this to when you recognize the scheme or the way that a door-to-door salesman is trying to sell you something. You can call it out in your head and you can be like, oh, that's the foot in the door scheme. I know what he's trying to do to me, so therefore I'm not falling for it. And it works the same way with our OCD symptoms. The last thing that I really liked about I-CBT is it introduced me to the idea of the feared self. So the idea is that sometimes with our OCD, you can notice, even though your obsessions will pivot to slightly different obsessions, right? Fear of, neglecting your animal, or fear of leaving the doors unlocked, or fear of leaving a stove or an appliance on and burning down the house. While those are all specifically, different obsessions, we can look into that and we can recognize there's a theme to those. All of those have to do with some amount of neglect. The fear is that I'm gonna neglect either my animal or locking the doors and leaving things, I'm gonna get hurt, someone's break in because I didn't do anything, or I'm gonna cause a fire because I forgot to turn off this appliance. And so what I really love about this is that we are better able to understand and cope with the OCD when we can recognize these patterns and recognize what they call a feared self, that at the core, beneath all the specific obsessions, there's this core fear of us being a negligent person that drives all these different obsessions on the surface. And when we can recognize that, again, like this kind of the recognizing the salesman tricks, oh, that's what my OCD's after. My OCD's trying to, poke at me again and make me believe that I'm not a responsible person. Then when we recognize the thought, it becomes less powerful. If any of this sounds interesting or helpful, feel free to reach out to me either by email or phone call. I'd love to hear from you and see if we would be a good match for therapy.